Well, good evening, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Alberto, for this invitation, because it provides me with an opportunity to discuss a matter that I think it's very important, but that we don't discuss so often, and it's the complementarity between EU and national merger law. We have so much ingrained this concept of exclusive competence, as you have said, EU law above the thresholds, national law below the thresholds, that we tend to describe these laws and to study and to discuss them as if they were quite independent elements, one from the other. We rather should look at them as a system, but we rarely do it. And this compares very strongly with the situation that we have today in antitrust, where both national authorities and the Commission apply the same law, where we have pretty sophisticated mechanisms of cooperation and convergence, and where it's not only that we have converged on matters of substance, but that now we are also trying to converge on matters of investigatory powers and procedures. There's the ECN Plus directive being discussed at the Council and Parliament that will establish a minimum common basis of enforcement powers across the Union to ensure that we have a minimum level of efficient enforcement across the antitrust. Then I'm grateful to be able to look at mergers also from this perspective. And I will try more to ask questions than to provide answers, but to look at this system of EU and national merger laws. And of course, things have evolved very much since the entry into force of the merger regulation. Actually, next year we will celebrate already the 30th anniversary of the adoption of the merger regulation. And when at the time we had one EU law and few national laws, we are now in a system where everywhere, with the exception of Luxembourg, we have a national merger law. Then we have a system with a EU and 27 national merger laws. And the national merger control plays a very important role, because at the end of the day, Brussels looks at, well, a bit less than 400 cases per year. But all member states together look at few thousands operations per year. And it's not only the numbers, it's also that, well, while we have clear allocation criteria, the mechanisms of referral that allow us to correct the raw allocation of cases initially have become much more common than they were in the past. As Alberto also reminded us, at the beginning, those were very exceptional occurrences. In the first 5 years of merger control, we had 5 cases of referral. Well, if we look at the situation after the reform in 2004, where we introduced the possibility to do pre-notification referrals, there have been close to 600 cases in both directions, either sent towards the EU or towards member states. That represents 13% of the total notifications. If we look only at last year, in 2017, 14 cases were referred from Brussels to national authorities, 3 only to Italy, and 16 cases moved in the opposite direction. Then, with these figures, national and EU merger law have become quite interchangeable. More than 10% of our cases move from one level to the other every year. I think we could still do better. There are still few hundred cases that are every year notified in more than one national competition authority. And also, still a good number notified to more than 3. That's why in all our recent consultations on possible reforms of the merger regulation, on the white paper of 2014, of our more recent consultation on modification of thresholds, we have always proposed to simplify these mechanisms of referral and to remove, let's say, the red tape, especially linked to referrals under Article 4.5, that is, referrals from cases that have to be notified to 3 member states and can be sent to the Commission. To date, we've had more than 340 referrals of this type, and there have only been 7 vetoes by member states. Then I think we can afford the risk of getting these cases directly notified to Brussels, and if in one case we have a veto, well, this is a cost that is worth bearing compared to the benefits that we can gain by eliminating additional forms and additional deadlines. If one day we reform the merger regulation, no doubt that this will be a reform that has been welcomed by everybody. But leaving aside this reform, already in the present situation, I think we have a system where a number of national authorities are dealing in parallel with quite a good number of cases, and in particular, we have quite a lot of referrals from Brussels to the member states. In this system, certainly to have a degree of convergence, a degree of interchangeability between this law becomes a necessity. Becomes a necessity to avoid conflicting outcomes between national authorities examining the case, becomes a necessity to ensure a level playing field across the EU, and also to simplify the cost of compliance for companies to deal with different systems. Let's look at whether we are already in this situation or whether there are differences that still matter. And let's start by substance. And I think it's very important at this point of time to ensure that we offer a good level of efficient merger enforcement across the EU. We're in a period where there are growing concerns about the impact of concentrations. We are clearly confronted to a merger wave. Last year, M&A operations around the world reached 3 trillion euros in value, and already all the operations concluded this year have reached 300 billion. In Europe, last year we had our second busiest year in terms of merger notifications, 380. We are already close to the pre-crisis levels. And while at the beginning of this merger wave, there were some sectors that were driving the process, basically telecoms and pharma, now we see restructuring across industries. We see some industries worldwide that are being completely restructured by mergers and acquisitions, for instance, in the agrochemicals or in the steel sector in Europe. But we also see concentration going on in more consumer-oriented products and services, in telecoms, in aviation, areas where experience shows that increases of concentration often leads to increases of prices and therefore to a decrease of customer buying power. But there are concerns that are emerging also beyond these more short-term impact on prices of concentrations. We are seeing more and more worries about the long-term impact of mergers, and in particular the impact of mergers on innovation. And it makes sense that in a continent where our major challenge from a macro perspective is to recover productivity, that competition authorities do not only look at short-term impact on prices, but also at longer terms of innovation. And we see new areas of concerns. People are worrying because large IT companies seem to be acquiring startups below the thresholds of notifications. People are worried because we see in some sectors common shareholdings spreading, and there start to be papers that show that these common shareholdings could have an impact on competition outcomes in these sectors. And finally, what we see, maybe more in the US than in Europe, is a debate that goes beyond the experts in the area of competition and is starting to question whether increased concentration is not only a problem for prices, but it goes beyond that, whether increased concentration could not be one explanation, among others, for the increase in inequality that we see in some societies, and at the end, for some of the political phenomenon that we are seeing nowadays. Then I think it's a particular good moment to ask, are we ensuring in Europe a sufficient degree of enforcement in merger control? And it's clear that if we look at the big picture, I think we have quite a degree of convergence on substantial analysis across authorities. We all have moved to a system that is based on sound economics. If you read guidelines adopted by different authorities on substance, you will not see major differences. But are we all applying these laws equally is, are we all focusing on the same priorities? If I look at the enforcement priorities of European merger control by the Commission in recent years, really we've had a major focus on the most obvious or the most risky cases. Elimination of direct competition between close competitors in oligopolistic markets. We have intervened in the last 3 years in 73 cases. In 66 of them, this was our major concern: unilateral effects on prices. On top of this, on 8 cases, we have looked also at the impact of innovation, on 3 others at coordinated effects, and in 8 cases, we looked at non-horizontal issues. Then a clear focus on the most dangerous type of operations. This is similar to what we do in antitrust. If you look at the decisions of the Commission in recent years, more than 50% of these decisions affect cartels. Again, the most obvious possible restriction of competition. And I think one of the great advantages that we can draw from the convergence that we've seen in the antitrust area is this focus across all competition authorities in Europe towards the most damaging types of behaviors. Since 2004, more than 300 cartels have been identified and sanctioned by both the Commission and the national competition authorities. Do we have the same common purpose and the same common priority in the area of mergers? I think this is one of the questions that it would worth discussing. But maybe we can go a bit further and looking at these type of interventions on oligopolistic markets, especially in a country like this one, where there was no change of test following the change of the Commission in 2004. We moved from the test of dominance to the significant impact of competition test. At the end, the words do not matter. The question is how you interpret them. But how the change of test has affected European merger control. In how many cases where we could not have found dominance, we have nevertheless intervened? It's a question that it's not so obvious to answer, because very often when we have identified unilateral effects as a result of a merger, we do not start to discuss in our decisions whether this also represents or not a creation or a strengthening of a dominant position. But we've done this exercise. We've looked at our decisions of 2 years, 15 and 16, to see in how many cases we have intervened and we could have not established a creation or a strengthening of dominance. And in 2015, of 22 interventions, 6 were what we in the time we would have called gap cases. And in 2016, of 27 interventions, 10 could be this type of gap cases. That is, cases that create a significant impact on effective competition because they eliminate competition between 2 close competitors, but without creating a market leader. That is, 1/3 of our interventions during these 2 years are based on gap cases. And in a period of increased concern about concentration, we think it's very useful to have this instrument. Again, is this type of interpretation one is that is possible across the EU? Another question that we can put for the future. But merger control is not about finding problems. Very often it's about finding solutions. Most of our interventions do not end up in a prohibition or in an abandonment. Most of our interventions end up with remedies. What about remedies? Well, here the approach of the Commission has always been very consistent, and I think it's an approach that is echoed in many national competition authorities, and it's a preference for structural solutions. In merger control, we care about the change of structures in the market, then the best solution is very often a structural one, a divestiture that eliminates the areas of concern. If I look at our practice of remedies, and here I have figures for a bit longer period, figures between 2011 and 2017. In this period, we have intervened in 116 cases, while 72% have been solved via structural remedies, via divestiture. Half of these divestitures have been of a standalone business and half of a more complex carve-outs. In recent years, we have devoted quite a lot of efforts to deal with these more complex divestitures to ensure that they lead to efficient remedies. We have even a little group inside the merger department of specialists in remedies that are moved from one case to another to ensure that what we learn in one case that has not worked well could work well, that is taken into account when we negotiate remedies again. Then this focus on structural remedies, is this again something that we can see across the Union? Here we are. The Commission, the Italian authority are well-resourced authorities that can put resources to make these things work. But we have many more smaller authorities in the network. Can they put the resources to ensure that these structural remedies at the end of the day also work and are effective? Those are some questions in the area of substantive assessment. I think if we look at jurisdiction, at procedures, obviously, the field is much more diverse. In the jurisdictional area, we have, in general, a notion of concentration based on the acquisition of control that is quite common across European jurisdictions. But we see also in many of them the ability to apply the merger rules to acquisitions of stakes that do not lead to control. And how national thresholds are defined? Well, very often on the basis of turnover, but we still see in some jurisdictions market share thresholds. And we have opened now a debate, both in Brussels and in a number of national capitals, about the need to think about value-based thresholds in order, among other things, to capture operations in the IT world where turnover may not be very meaningful, but nevertheless, very substantial values are paid for a number of operations. Facebook, WhatsApp, it's the typical example of this. And we have seen that some member states have even started to introduce changes and introduce some of these thresholds, like in Germany and Austria, and others have opened a debate, like very recently, the French authority. And obviously, in procedures, we see also a diversity of the type of information that one needs to provide in notifying cases, of the deadlines that are required, and of the powers of investigation. The CN Plus directive and all the preparatory work has demonstrated that while all authorities had a good basis of enforcement rights, there were patchworks, and here and there one was missing an important power to ensure efficient enforcement. And obviously this will also apply in mergers. Then I think we need to question, in view of this, well, not exact symmetry across merger control in national and EU levels, whether we should worry about this. Does this matter at the end of the day? Is it good to have different standards? Maybe that allows us to experiment, to find more effective ways to deal with new phenomena. Certainly, the introduction of a new value thresholds by the German and Austrian authorities will be something that we will be watching closely to see whether they have achieved a right balance between the need to capture these operations and not create unnecessary red tape for companies. And we can learn from this to introduce changes in other jurisdictions. But on the other hand, can we afford to leave areas in the Union where maybe merger control is not as effective as it could be? I think those are questions that we will need to address in the future, and maybe we will need to find mechanisms to deal with them. We have already some mechanisms in practice. Actually, we have a number of what we could call soft law or peer review mechanisms. Already a few years ago, we created the ECN group on mergers that meets 3 times per year, co-chaired by 2 national authorities, where the Commission also plays an impulsion role. This is a group that discusses aspects of the EU and national laws in all these areas, in jurisdiction, in substance. It allows us to map the differences, but it also allows us to have discussions that should lead to, let's say, voluntary and unilateral convergence. The group is, for instance, starting now an exercise of looking at different practices on remedies to see whether there is maybe some best practices can derive and that can be shared across authorities at the end of the day. We have also some more hard law solutions, even if they are applied rarely, but we have seen this year the Court of Justice trying to fill the gap. For the first time, we've dealt this year with two prejudicial rulings of the European Court of Justice interpreting EU law. There was one, Austrian asphalt, on a very narrow jurisdictional issue at the end of last year, and there's one ongoing on an issue of gun jumping, on the interpretation of the notion of concentration. And this one is an interesting one, because it's not related to the interpretation of the EU merger regulation, but it is related to the interpretation of Danish merger law. And the opinion of the Advocate General, adopted 2 weeks ago, was very clear in terms of jurisdiction. The Advocate General didn't question at all that the Court of Justice could interpret Danish law when this Danish law was a replica of EU law. The Advocate General devoted only 2 paragraphs to this, and looking at previous case law, concluded that the court should interpret this notion of Danish law based on the fact that on the preparatory works of the merger Danish law, they made reference to the European merger regulation. Then we have an opportunity also for some convergence through the intervention of the Court of Justice. But in the past, people have proposed measures that would go much beyond what we have now on the table. A few years ago, a report by the French authority, the CV report, proposed to move beyond, and most importantly, I would say, a former Prime Minister of this country and Competition Commissioner, Mario Monti, in 2010, proposed this idea of creating an European merger area. An idea that basically means moving in mergers to the antitrust system, where the thresholds would not be any longer the criteria that would divide which law is applicable. We would all apply EU law. The thresholds would only decide which authority applies it. Well, as I said, today I'm not here to provide answers to all these issues, but those are ideas that are worth contemplating looking ahead. And I hope with this, overview, very high-level overview of the present situation, I may have raised a number of questions for a debate in the future, and maybe some of our co-panelists will dare to reply to some of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. You went beyond what was expected, so it's fine. And now adesso do la parola a Roberto Chieppa, segretario generale dell'Autorità. Grazie.